Good evening. If you would open your Bibles to Mark chapter 7, we are going to try to cover 2 chapters tonight, and we shall see how that goes. The first section of Mark 7 is verses 1 through 23. Mark says that there were some leaders, religious leaders, calls them Pharisees. Pharisees get a bad rap in the New Testament. When you hear the word Pharisee, you think something negative. What's fascinating about that is if you weren't reading the New Testament, if you were just reading the literature outside the New Testament about what was going on in Judaism in the first century, you would think the Pharisees were the best thing since sliced bread. That's not a metaphor to the bread used in the last chapter, just, bread. I can tell you some stories that would make you very much admire the Pharisees. They started in the intertestamental period. There was a leader who rose up who wasn't quite doing things by Old Testament standards. And there was a group saying, that's all right, let's just follow whatever the new leader wants to do. And that becomes a group called the Herodians. They follow that line. Then there were some Jewish leaders who said, no, we need to follow what I think that the Old Testament teaches and the traditions of our fathers, even if that means putting our own lives on the line. And that was a group called the Pharisees. And they actually went to the leader and said, you are not following the ways of the Lord, and I know that you think you're in charge, but God's actually in charge. I want you to know, here's how we're going to do things whenever we're dealing with our own religion, because this is right. It's what our God commands. And the guy in charge puts his knife out and says, want to say that again? And the Pharisees, all of them, stretch their necks up and say, do whatever you got to do. We're going to follow our God. Sounds noble, doesn't it? It's the Pharisees. They were the Bible class teachers. They were the ones teaching the law. 2 things I also want to say in commending them. One is the Apostle Paul. We all like the Apostle Paul, don't we? The Apostle Paul has a background. Where do you think he got all of his knowledge about the law and about obeying God no matter what? Remember what his religious background was? He was a Pharisee. Something else. There were 2 major groups, Pharisees and the Sadducees. And we all know the song, Pharisees aren't fair, you see, and Sadducees are sad, you see. But there's more to it than that. The Sadducees only accepted the first 5 books of Moses and none of the rest. Well, there's some reason for that. They also did not believe in resurrection. If you go back to the earliest books, you'll see that the idea of afterlife resurrection, it kind of develops over time and how the Jews think about that. So you get the earliest books and you can kind of cut a lot of that out. Not all of it, but you can cut a lot of that out. Why wouldn't they believe in resurrection? Well, the Sadducees were the landowners. They had the money and the power, and they often used people to their own benefit and not others. And the last thing you want is to find out that people that you had under your thumb, that died under your thumb, are coming back from the dead. That's not good news. Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection. They didn't believe in angels and spirits. They didn't believe the rest of the Bible. So the Pharisees did. Pharisees did. It's why Jesus says in Matthew 23, do what they say, but not what they do. They sit in Moses' seat. Have I said some good things about the Pharisees? Okay, now let's talk about how bad they were. So, the Pharisees, at least in theory, had good hearts who wanted to follow the Bible, Old Testament, who were willing to put their life on the line for it, who gave their lives to serving the Scriptures, and were known as people of the book. And Jesus has some very harsh things to say to them. Remember, the Gospel of Mark is a challenge to all of us. So, remember in the chapter 6, Jesus has trouble in his own hometown. The people who should know him best are the ones who understand him the least. Mark is trying to say some harsh things, and he's going to say it to people of the book who know their Bibles and have given their lives to serve in the Bible and just want to follow God. And he's going to say, Yep, you still have some things you need to learn. Some Pharisees and some scribes come down from Jerusalem. They gather around him, and in verse 2, they notice something. What do they notice? Yes, somebody sent a message, a very good message, and said, could I repeat what somebody says for the sake of the video and anybody who can't hear it? So if I say what you're saying, it's not because you didn't say it well, it's because I'm trying to repeat it. So Mickey says that they noticed that the followers, some of these people, were not eating with washed hands. Now, my Bible here, this is the New Revised Standard, I think, it says they were eating with defiled hands. Did any of your Bibles actually use the word bread or loaves? Yours does? Okay, that's in the Greek. It actually says eating the loaves, eating the breads, and it's plural. It's the same one at the end of chapter 6 where it says they didn't understand concerning the loaves or the breads. Remember, chapter 7 is on the heels of chapter 6, and there were no chapter breaks in the original. I know that we love, when we read our novels, we end a chapter, and that's the time we can go get our soda, we can go use the bathroom, or we can take a break, and we can get back and start a new chapter. There were no chapter breaks in the original. Somebody came along later and did that. So remember, when you're reading this, and sometimes there weren't even line breaks. Sometimes punctuation wasn't always so clear. So one of the last things you'll remember reading in chapter 6 is that Jesus taught them a message about the bread, which is that God supplies your bread. And if you know that, you'll know you can trust him for everything. That's the message you're supposed to remember about the bread. That God's in charge, you're not, and he comes to your rescue. The next time bread is mentioned in the plural, what it says is, the Pharisees come down, and what they don't notice is God supplies bread for people. God gives you more than enough. God gives you enough for the day. Sometimes God calls on you to be the bread for the world. God will rescue you at the sea, and you remember that he always supplies for your need. Doesn't remember any of that. That's not what they notice. They don't notice what God does for hurting people. What they notice is rule violation. That's what they notice. I have to suspect that part of what Paul's getting onto is the kinds of things these people tend to constantly notice. Jerry Seinfeld became famous as a comedian for saying, have you ever noticed? And then he names all these really odd things. And pretty soon you realize, oh no, but you notice those things, and that's what makes you you. The Pharisees and the scribes tended to notice these kinds of things a lot. And the way that that leads to noticing these kinds of things a lot is emphasizing these kinds of things a lot. It's navel gazing. It's being more interested in whether or not people are following the rules than what the end result is that God intended the rules to lead to. They notice that disciples are eating with unwashed hands. They notice other people's problems, not their own. They notice a rule violation. Now, Mark has to say something in parentheses, which many people believe is a sign that Mark is writing to a Gentile audience. He explains, the Pharisees and all the Jews, they always wash their hands before they eat. In fact, they wash everything. I mean, cups, pots, kettles, you name it. They wash those things. It's part of their traditions. So the Pharisees and the scribes ask him, why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? Okay. It is true that if you go back and look carefully at the Old Testament, there was some examples of consecrating, at setting apart, things like cups and dishes and vessels. Chief example is in the tabernacle or in the temple. Very last chapter of 2 Kings talks about when a place got ransacked, they took all the bronze cups, kettles, vessels that were in the holy places, And that's because these things were set apart. And of course, they were expensive, bronze and silver, but also these were cups and things set apart. Washing was one way of separating. We don't just think of germ theory. That's kind of a later thing. Not so much that. It's more like when you wash your hands clean of something, it's separating out, doing something new. This was a way of separating out. But it's also true that we're talking about tradition and not actual law, because in the Old Testament, it was the priests who were supposed to wash their hands before they eat everything. There's really no command that I could find that's on the level of the lay people having to do that. That seems to be one of those examples where the leaders said, well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and if everybody should be ultimately like their teachers and masters, then let's make the same rule for them, that's for us. It's kind of like reading some quality of an elder and saying, that's a good quality, every Christian should do that, and then requiring every member to fit that description in order to be a member. It's kind of like that. It's making an extra hedge around the law. Yes? It's the whole thing. Okay. So Jesus is listening to this and he says, Isaiah prophesied right about you, hypocrites. It's written, this people honors me with their lips, their hearts are far from me, in vain they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and you hold to human tradition. Boy, that sounds harsh. I just noticed that they didn't wash their hands first. Sounds harsh. Let's keep reading. Then he said, you have a fine way of rejecting the commands of God in order to keep your traditions. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever speaks evil of father or mother must surely die. But you say that if anyone tells her father or mother, whatever support you might have got from me, whatever money you think I have that I could set aside to help you, I've dedicated it to God. It's Corban. And if you do that, well, then you're not required to use that to help your mom and dad. Thus making void the word of God through your tradition. You've given them a law I didn't give that now they use as the backdrop for not honoring their father and mother, which is the law I did give. And you have handled, that you've done this through your tradition, you've handed it on. And the next line, and you do many things like this. Well, on the one hand, maybe on the first level, this is a warning to all of us teachers. Remember that passage in James? Be not many of you teachers. Is Casey in the room, McDonald? I don't think he's in the room. Casey's job is to get teachers for every semester. He's probably thinking, yes, we take this very seriously. Be not many teachers. It's always hard to find teachers for classes. Be not many teachers because you'll receive greater condemnation. Well, sure, there's that. There's that. But there's more to it than that. Jesus calls the crowd and he says, listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile them, but the things that come out are what defile. When he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. Of course they did. They have spent their whole lives being raised, going to church, Jewish church, and being told what makes you different, all the nations around you, is that you keep these codes. And it's how you know you're right with God. It's how you know that he's your God and you're his people, and you obey these rules. It's how you find security. And you never touch that. You know that from the time you're 2. You don't touch that because it will defile you. And Jesus says, there's nothing outside a person that by going in can defile them. So, his disciples say, could you explain that, please? And he says, do you also fail to understand? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and then goes out the sewer? Okay, that alone, all of that's already hard to take. He's saying there's nothing outside a person that can defile them. It sounds very different than what they've heard growing up. And then he says, don't you understand that when you eat something, eat food, it just goes into your stomach, not into your heart? But what about all these food laws? And then Mark adds this line in parentheses that you won't find in Matthew's version. You remember how Matthew's got a different sermon to preach. In Mark's version, it says, thus he declared all foods clean. Now, we know that's true. Number one, it's right here in Scripture. Paul affirms that in Romans 14 and verse 20. All things are lawful. All foods are clean. But he says it right here as a law-abiding Jew to the teachers of the law, to the crowd, to the disciples. He says, there's nothing outside a person that can defile them. When asked what that means, Mark says he was saying, all foods are clean. And he said, it's what comes out of a person that defiles, for it's from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. And then he names a bunch of things. Fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. True or false? It is right and biblical and God-honoring and to obey God's word. True or false? True. True. I'm 43. You can't get to be 43 and not know that. That's true. That is correct. That is right. Obedience is a clear teaching in both Old Testament and New Testament. Let me go further. The same Jesus that is speaking in Mark 7 is the same God who gave the Old Testament law. Don't forget that. The same God who gave the 10 Commandments, the same God who gave the food laws, now says it's nothing outside a person that can defile them, and he declares all foods clean. So we got to deal with this somehow. I think that there are ditches on both sides of truth. And if we're going to take the whole Bible, and I'm going to take a few minutes here, if we take the whole Bible, we will see many, many passages that warn us about this ditch. But this ditch is Matthew's sermon. If you read Matthew's account of this story, he goes out of his way to show you, number one, Jesus does not violate the law. Number two, everything he says fits with what you would expect somebody who knows the law well to say about the real intention of the law. And number three, there are no lines that would spook somebody who really cares about the fine details of the law. Matthew makes that clear on this side because he wants to say, and this is a true biblical teaching, God expects you to be someone who keeps his rules. Okay. Keeping God's rules, living by the rules, keeping God's law is a true and biblical sermon. And if I was teaching Matthew's gospel, I'd spend half the class making this point. But if I do that, we will miss Mark's sermon, which is also true, but meant to challenge us on the other side. Here's Mark's sermon. Legalism is a killer. And it's often present when we don't realize it. I want to recommend a book. This is a book by Norman Bales, B-A-L-E-S, called How Do I Know I'm Saved? This was published by Gospel Advocate in the mid-'80s, which means I'm not certain it's still in print. You may not be able to find a new copy, but I know I looked on Amazon. You can find used copies. He lived in Oklahoma for a while. How Do I Know I'm Saved? It's a great book on so many levels. And he's got a chapter in here called Legalism and Grace, and he uses some illustrations that I thought were very helpful. So I want to use some of them here. Legalism is not the same thing as keeping God's rules, because we're supposed to do that. Legalism is an excessive need to conform to rules as your identity marker, which often causes you to overlook the substance and meaning of it or the people with whom you have to deal. So a couple of signs of legalism. Legalism reduces Christianity to rule keeping and says that's what it is. It's the kind of thing where, the constant one-liners of what it means to be a Christian is, we don't smoke and we don't chew and we don't go with girls that do. That's what it means to be a Christian. In Acts 15, some men came down from Judea to Antioch, and they were teaching the brothers, unless you're circumcised, you can't be saved. Everybody in this room will say, well, that's ridiculous. That's silly. Why would anybody think that? I'll tell you why. These were new Christians who had made the huge jump from everything they've ever heard their entire life growing up and everything they taught from the synagogue pulpit. Now they've accepted Jesus as the Messiah, and in many ways, they've kind of been turned away, outcast of the community they grew up in. In their minds, they left everything to follow Jesus. Yes, I know you've already read between the lines. There were Pharisees in the early church. We'll talk about that some other day. But they say, if you're going to be a Christian, you've got to accept Jesus, but you also have to be circumcised. What they thought was, I know my Bible. This is the mark. This is the mark of being the people of God. It's just been ingrained in me. It's all I've ever known since I'm little. Everybody I've ever spent time with who loves God, the Father of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, knows this. So somehow you've got to accept Jesus and you've got to do this. They didn't think they were adding rules. They thought they were being faithful to God. They wouldn't have thought that what they were really saying was, Christ may be the door, but I'm the screen door. They didn't think that. They thought they were being faithful to God. And it was just blowing their minds to imagine that God is going to open the door to the Gentiles and accept them as they are and let them become Christians and don't have to do these identity markers or these food laws or these kosher, all these things that have always marked out God's people. You can be God's people and not do those things. It was hard to comprehend. Can that happen, in our own world? Sure it can. Here are some examples he uses. He says, a friend of mine in Texas tells a bizarre story of how misunderstanding coupled with devotion to tradition can create near panic. There was a man at a church there who was not a member of that church, but he owned a vineyard. And he thought it would be a nice gesture to donate grape juice from his vineyard for the communion service. And the elders of the church accepted the man's generous offer, but forgot to tell the congregation that they were making a change in grape juice suppliers. The juice from the donor's vineyard turned out to be slightly different in color from the store-bought variety, and many members were highly offended. Some even refused to come back to services on Sunday night. The elders got letters accusing them of introducing Kool-Aid into the communion service and were asked to provide biblical authority for such a practice. And he says, you can understand that when you're used to something a certain way, especially if it's tied to something very important and sacred, separating out what the sacred is and what the tradition is can be hard. I was living in England. I went to a church in London. They had fermented grape juice. And even though I knew going in, for some reason, I should have known this is pretty common, when I got mine, I turned to my wife and I said, I think this has gone bad. I remember saying that. I wasn't ready for it. It's a jolt. He says here, how do you think the church would have reacted if they had put white grape juice in the communion trays? He uses some other examples. In the 1920s, there were books written about the bobbed hair controversy. Has anybody heard of that or know what we're talking about? Bobbed hair. This was a big deal about how women wore their hair. And he says there was a fad in the 1920s called the bobbed hair fad, and there were books about why you shouldn't do this. And he says bobbed hair would scarcely raise a ripple of protest in today's church. But 50 years later, the granddaughters of those ladies who first bobbed their hair found themselves locked in mortal combat over the propriety of wearing pantsuits to church. And he says that too has pretty well subsided in most areas, but traditions die hard. And there's nearly always someone who believes the scriptures have been compromised when a cherished tradition is discarded. He says, when I was young, the preachers around me condemned the practice of attending movies. Let me just make a side note. I read an article by a teacher I really respect who lived in the 1800s. I really respect. I could tell you all the reasons why I wish we read everything he ever wrote, but everybody's a product of their culture. He wrote an article about why it's a sin to go to the movies, and his argument was people that are not married often kiss each other. All movies were on the forbidden list. Those featuring Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, or cartoons that were considered just as wrong as those starring Tyrone Power or Clark Gable or Jane Russell. And their argument was that attending a movie classified one as a moviegoer. And in their view, the public wouldn't be intelligent enough to know whether one only went to Gene Autry movies or also went to watch Jane Russell. And they were certain that if others saw a member put his money down at the box office window, they would judge him as a person who would be attracted to the most lurid films Hollywood could offer. And he says, what's interesting is that you'll often find this to be the case when you travel around and you'll find out a church or a group or a culture in a different part of the world or even the country will have just as strong views, but it's a different set of issues. But it's because it's what they were raised with, and this is the line, the identifying marker that makes us who we are. So those are examples he uses to say, this can happen to any of us, all of us. And the problem with legalism is that it reduces Christianity to rule keeping. And when you do that, you notice rules more than anything else, and then you begin to create new side rules to guard the main rules, because rules rule the day. There's a better answer than this. And that's what Jesus seems to be challenging in Mark 7. He seems to be saying there are people who matter to God, and they're getting crushed because you didn't notice that they were hurting people. You noticed they didn't wash their hands. You didn't notice that there are hearts, maybe even your own hearts, he says, that are thinking and focusing on wrong things. But you don't notice hearts. You notice unwashed hands. And that's where he makes this huge challenge and says, I want you to change the nature of the game. If you're thinking about hearts and you're thinking about how to get our hearts right with God, you may not notice so much that the hands were unwashed, as much as those are hands that God wants to hold. So, verses 1 through 23 seems to me not to be saying, who cares about obeying God? That's not his point. His point seems to be, you have defined yourself by your traditions. What you notice are rules, and that hurts me because I want you to notice hearts. Okay, I've lectured. What are your thoughts or additions or questions about verses 1 through 23? Yes, sir.
I thought that a lot of those rules they were given were protected because they didn't fully understand. You mentioned germs earlier. It was the 19th century before man understood about germs.
That's right.
But God told them when they needed to carry newborn, so when they had excrement, they covered it up. But people didn't understand the danger of that from a health perspective. There were a lot of other rules and regulations. I think some of the diet and everything had to do with the dangers of eating food that from animals that were predators or whatever. The germs would be involved. So I think a lot of it were for good purpose.
Yes. And you know what's interesting, if I can add to your point.
Forever.
Yes, and the point he was making is that some of these rules that God gives covered more than just some religious ritual. It actually protected them in ways they didn't even fully realize, which is the point. God has already baked into the rules he gave us protection from lots of things. He doesn't need us to help him by adding extra rules to his rules in order to protect the people. Okay, verses 24 to verse 30 is a story about a woman from the region of Tyre. You may remember the phrase, the cities Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon are known for being an example of bad cities. Jesus one time is trying to make the point about, things are going to go bad for you. And he says, it's going to be more tolerable on the day of judgment for Tyre and Sidon than it is for you. It's kind of like, saying, I'm going to start naming cities, but I shouldn't do that. So you get the idea, okay? Not every place is as holy as Circe, but you get the idea. He says, so this is the region of Tyre. He enters a house, didn't want anybody to know he was there, but he couldn't escape notice. And a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him. And she came and she bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, Syrophoenician, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Little background. Jesus is in a non-Jewish area, or he's dealing with somebody who's not from that background. He came to reach the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That's his main focus. He's going to empower his apostles to go and open the doors to the Gentiles. But in keeping with the prophecies of the Old Testament, the gospel goes to the Jew first and then to the Greek. This is his main focus. But he's also somebody with deep compassion. This woman comes from Tyre, and she's got a child who's hurting. Now, where have I heard this before? It's a story in the Old Testament. In fact, I've got the reference here. 1 Kings chapter 17. Verses 8 through 16. It's a woman from this area. And Elijah needs some food and goes to her and says, could you give me some bread? So much bread and this stuff. Can you give me some bread? She says, I wish I could, but there's not enough for my child and me. In fact, I'm just going to get some kindling wood to make a fire and to eat what little we have, and then we're all going to die. She says that. And he says, no, I'll tell you what. Go and make bread for me. And then what's left, make it for you and your kid. And I promise you, as surely as the Lord lives, you will not run out of food. She does that. For the rest of his time there's enough food for all of them. That's a miracle story to a woman in this area. The next story after that, he goes back because she has a child who's either about to die or dies. The text isn't real clear. And Elijah stretches himself out over the child. And when he's done, the child is in perfect health. There's a story of a woman who's outside the main camp who gets helped and healed, including the child. This is the background. This is what God does. You got to know that to understand the next verse. This is not the story that I would use to introduce people to Jesus. I'd want them to know his character before they read this story. Because the next verse says, he said to her, let the children be fed first. It's not fair to take the children and throw it to the dogs. I have read commentaries that try to make this very smooth, very gentle. There's no way to do that. There has never been a culture where it was polite to refer to a woman as a dog. There's never been a culture where that was a polite thing to do. We miss the point if we try to make Jesus' words nice and kind, as you would expect Jesus to use. You miss the point. There has to be something else going on, and I'm going to make some guesses. I'm going to see what you think about this. Jesus might be setting her up to be able to say something that makes her the hero of the story. There's lines that you can't say unless somebody gives you a setup first. There are stories all through the Old Testament where somebody, often I'm thinking of examples where you have a great king and he's supposed to be the hero, but he does something foolish, but the way he says it sets up the woman in the story to say something wise, and she becomes the hero in the story. Jesus may be using language that all the people around him are thinking, maybe what they were saying to themselves. And he puts it out there to say, how would you respond to that? And look what she says. Yes, sir. But even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. You know what she says? Yes, I'm a dog. I'm a scoundrel. I'm a scrapper. I'm nobody. I'm nothing. But if I'm a dog, make me a puppy in your house. If I'm a dog, I'll take whatever falls from the table. I know I don't deserve to sit at the table. Do you hear the heart? Reminds you of the prodigal son on his way home. I don't deserve to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. The exact opposite of the kind of heart you see in the leaders who only think about looking at other people's mistakes. Do you think she noticed that the disciples were eating with unwashed hands? How about this? Do you remember a chapter before Jesus feeds the people and the apostles don't seem to realize or think that he's got that kind of power? And they're like, no, tell them to go take care of themselves. And so Jesus feeds the 5,000. And when he's done, they take up 12 baskets full of scraps. Same word. Crumbs. They don't think that Jesus can do this. Jesus does it and gives them crumbs to remind them of something. And she says, I'll take the crumbs. It's the exact opposite kind of response. It's humility. It's recognizing I'm an outsider. I'm a nobody. I'll take whatever you want to give me. And the truth is, that's what everybody in the gospel should be saying about themselves. And so he says, for saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. And she goes home and finds the child lying on the bed, and the demon's gone. The contrast is so strong. The conversations are so different. She's not wasting her time fighting over the kinds of things that Jesus is so upset about earlier in the chapter. This is a person who's hurting, and she'll do whatever it takes to help them, and she recognizes I'm a nobody. It takes too much pride to get caught up in these other things. And she has none of that. Verses 31 to 37 is another very interesting story in which we have a man who is deaf and has a speech impediment. And Jesus puts his fingers in his ears. He spits and touches his tongue. He looks up to heaven and he says, be opened. And his ears were opened, his tongues were released, and he spoke plainly. But look again, verse 31. He returned from the region of Tyre and went by the way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the Gentile area of the Decapolis. What we're getting is, after arguing with the Pharisees about minute traditions that are meant for certain people, now he is going, and throughout his regions, he's healing people so far outside of the norm that those rules wouldn't have even ever thought to apply to them. And he's healing them, and he's bringing them into the fold. And they know who Jesus is, and they're saying all the right things. Verses 36 and 37, they proclaim it. When Jesus says, don't tell anybody, they proclaim it all the more. He's done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. In chapter 8, he does some more of these miracle stories, and Mark is fond of this, what's called coupling. He does feed the 5,000, and now he feeds the 4,000. And feeding the 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, he feeds the 4,000 with 7 loaves. But what's interesting is it's repeating a point. And you got to think about what's put between the stories. It's kind of like a director of a movie. You have the story, you have some teaching, and then you have a story that reminds you of the first one, and it's sandwiches like bread on the outside of the peanut butter and jelly, in which the teaching illustrates what's going on both sides. And at the beginning, he says, do you understand what it means to think that God provides bread? And then in between, God literally gives what's needed to outsiders, which reminds us of a bread story where God gave bread to a woman who needed it in Tyre and Sidon. And now in chapter 8, we have the story again about bread. And he says, verse 11, the Pharisees came and began to argue with him. Oh, there we are again. They're not here to help. They're not here to heal. They're not here to love. They're not here to serve. They're here to argue. That's what they notice. And they ask him for a sign from heaven to test him. Boy, there's a lot littered in verse 12. He sighed deeply in his spirit. I mean, you know, when you're the Holy One, this is about the crudest you can get. He sighs deeply in his spirit. That's his way of saying, I can't believe what I have to deal with. Why does this generation ask for a sign? No sign's going to be given to them. And he leaves and he gets in the boat. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread. That's almost a comic relief moment, isn't it? You know, he feeds 5,000, he feeds 4,000. Disciples are like, I forgot the lunch. What are we going to do? They only had one loaf with them in the boat. Now, this is important. There's only one loaf in the boat. And he cautioned them, watch out. Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. Yeast is the stuff you use to make the bread rise. It's the leavening stuff. Just a little bit goes a long way. Surely he's talking about the attitude, the mindset, the things they notice, the things they want to talk about, the things they want to fight about. Hebrews says, beware lest a little bit of bitterness, he calls it the root of bitterness, rises up and gets a hold of you. And they said, after Jesus said, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, they look at each other and say, oh, it's because we didn't bring the bread. That's what's going on here. Yeah, Jesus is saying, you know, you guys really should have brought some, at least some Little Debbies or something. And becoming aware of it, Jesus says, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not get it? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? Do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, you had 12 baskets. When I fed the 4,000 with 7 loaves, you had 7 baskets. Do you not understand? Do you not understand? I've got to think, I'm trying to ask myself, do I not understand? Am I not getting this? I've got some ideas, but I want to ask you. He seems like we should know this. Somebody tell me, what do you think he's trying to say? He says, why don't you get it? What do you think he's trying to say? Okay, what comes to your mind about the numbers?
Well, 7.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things you can do with the numbers. Jim is saying that, you know, the 12 is 12 tribes of Israel. Does the 7 represent like the 7 cities or something like that? Or what's going on with the Decapolis? Decapolis, there is 5, but I know there's a 7 that ties in somehow. Maybe there's some to that. It seems to me that by saying, do you not understand? He's really challenging them not just to read and do. Can I tell you how I believe it's important to read your Bible and do what it says? But there's a very important middle step between read and do, and that is to reflect. And I don't know if I do that enough. Jesus, when he challenges the Pharisees, is so interesting. He says, have you not read? That's an interesting line. Then he also says, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. In other words, you read and you do, but did you reflect? Did you reflect? Because if you read this law and you go and do this law, and the way you do this law ends up running right over hurting people, you probably have not reflected on what I was trying to accomplish here. As Jesus says, the law, the Sabbath was not, man was not made for the Sabbath was made for man. There's this idea of, I have laws and rules, but they're meant to lead towards helping people see God at work. And it says in verse 22 that they bring a blind man and they beg him to touch him. And this is the only story I know of in the entire Bible, and I've got 2 minutes. The only story I know of in the entire Bible where it looks like Jesus does a healing that only partially takes. The strangest thing. The man is blind. Jesus puts spits in the man's eyes, and then the man opens his eyes, and Jesus says, "What do you see?" And he says, "Well, I see people like trees walking around." So then Jesus has to do it again, and the second time he sees everything clearly. A friend of mine, I think I told you, teaches a class and asks his students, "What happened here?" And over all the years of asking, his favorite answers from students are, number one, temporary power outage. He was low on batteries. No. And then his favorite one, the guy couldn't see clearly because he, quote, had spit in his eyes. There's got to be more going on here. And I really like this take. It's not original with me. The story right after it, Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And after they list a bunch of things other people think, Peter jumps up and says, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God. You're the Messiah," which sounds like the right answer. But it's partially right. It's the right words. But Peter doesn't fully understand what that means. He thinks Messiah means you're the one with power. But the truth is, to be the Messiah is to be the one who gives up your power, surrenders it, dies, so God can be all in all. And so, is it right or wrong? It's partially right. Peter needs to take a second look. You've read the prophecies about the Messiah, but you need to reflect on it. You need to think about it. And you need to think about it through the lens of watching what I do. Because if you watch me in all these chapters, it'll change how you read those prophecies. You'll see things you didn't see before. So I think that it's a double touch healing because it's a double meaning. It's a second look that one needs to take, just as it's a second touch in order for the healing to take. We have 1.5 minutes. Does anyone want to add something? That's a place for me to stop. I want to talk about the taking up your cross next week. So anybody have anything you want to add or a question you want to ask? If it's a question, Ralph will answer it for us. Yes, Stan.
It does say, "You said you see things," because again, he said, the first one about the man with that implies that he wasn't being encouraged. So,
It may be. Isn't it amazing that after the second touch, it's not just okay. It says he saw everything clearly. It wasn't that Jesus couldn't do it, but he had to look intently. He had to look intently, and then he saw everything clearly. The challenge for all of us, let us obey the commandments. Let's obey the teaching of the Bible, but let's look intently. Let's reflect on what this is all about so that our actions don't hide the Messiah, but reveal him to the hurting people around us. Thank you for being here. I've enjoyed the study with you. Next time, we're going to take a look at chapter 9, and this is the second half of Mark. Remember, the first half is power, power, power. Second half is only one miracle story because it's all about giving up power for the sake of the kingdom. Great to have you here.